My name is Colin Bennett. I'm a writer. I've written two novels and I've written two non-fiction books. One of the non-fiction books was published by Head Press, and this is Politics of the Imagination, a book about Charles Fort, an American writer, a very important American writer at the turn of the century. The other non-fiction book was about George Adamski, the UFO visionary, who claimed that he'd met a man that he considered to be from Venus, which of course naturally caused a lot of trouble at the time. I deal with Charles Fort and George Adamski because I'm interested in the American hero and American society in terms of these rather odd figures who were published writers and who were very successful. And George Adamski went on world tours and was a very popular person, but they're very controversial writers. But I like to see American psyche through these highly individualized, idiosyncratic writers. And I've just finished a book, for instance, on another leading American figure, Captain Ruppelt of the United States Air Force, who was head of Project Blue Book in 1953. He was an Air Force captain and initiated the first official United States Air Force investigation into UFOs. I've just finished that book, and that indeed is being done by Head Press, as well as Politics of the Imagination. I'm a postmodernist. I'm interested in techno and avant-garde expression, but I have a degree in literature, so I'm interested in these things in the context of 20th century literature, and the Charles Fort book in particular, which we're talking about at the moment in the main, aren't we? Yes. Okay, fine, yeah.
Could I just ask you
Yes, go
what
ahead.
you mean by techno?
Yeah. There's the web, for example, is full of strange phrases such as techno shamanism and so on. The technology is reaching a region where, for better or for worse, it's developing spiritual, if you like, analogues and spiritual inspirations through the theory of cyber. What is cyber? I suppose Charles Fort would have very good answer to that, because I regard Charles Fort to be one of the leading first postmodernists. What is cyber? It's Platonic. It's basically a Platonic idea. Plato's idea, if you remember, was that reality is always an approximation in the final analysis. He used the analogy of the prisoners tethered in a cave in such a manner they cannot turn round. Their heads cannot turn. There is a fire at the mouth of the cave. The prisoners, of course, can't see the fire. They can only see the shadows cast by the fire. This was Plato's expression of his conception of reality. And this was picked up in Europe, picked up and dropped indeed in Europe, much later, of course, during the Renaissance, as a very good idea, as European philosophy got into gear again after the Renaissance. The trouble is the mechanists, the developing scientists and mathematicians of the age of reason, went in for concrete objectivity, which of course opposes Plato's idea of our perceptions being approximations. And this was the start of a huge cultural battle which Charles Fort inherited. And this conflict between Platonic approximations and the concrete objective approach of science is a thing which still bedevils us. Yeah. You can hear it in the UFO debates, you can hear it in the debates about the paranormal, about occultism, and about the theory of anomalies. It's the same scientific objectivity versus Platonic approximations. Fort took up the baton and wrote a book in which he discussed these things. He was rejecting the mechanism of the 19th century. He was born a young man, let's not talk about when people were born, when they were in their formative youth. It's more important in pre-1914 America. Now, pre-1914 America was a scene of mechanistic triumph. Henry Ford and the great inventors, the great mechanistic inventors and creators, were the gods of the pre-1914 American universe. And they were commercial gods too. And it was all about money. It was all about the accretion of wealth. It was the formation of the modern American capitalist consciousness. Ford was against this, which of course is not a very good position to be in if your another god is facing Henry Ford. And he wrote a book called The Book of the Damned, in which he saw that the industrial mechanistic world of Henry Ford and company was opposed by closer observation of the world. What was this closer observation of the world? He spent his time, did Ford, in American libraries. He was a very, very poor man, but he couldn't knock in a nail. And as such, he lived in terrible poverty all his life, spending his time in libraries. And what was he in libraries for? He was searching through every single magazine and newspaper and article in the world. What for? He was looking for hairline cracks in perception. This is the Fordian theory. Hairline cracks in perception, to find the anomaly or contradiction or paradox within the scheme of things which gave lie to the system as an objective, concrete manifestation. Yeah. What were these hairline cracks in reality? What were these anomalies and paradoxes that he found that defied the idea that outer reality was a supine thing, a dead thing that you examined at will? He found examples of the most extraordinary things. Reigns of frogs, for example. Yeah. Periwinkles strewn over Sussex in an hour. Here's the beginning of the Fordian theory, the Royal Road to the Fordian theory. Take the example of a newspaper reporting that countless millions of periwinkles, for God's sake, were found strewn over a county in Essex overnight. The explanation was, says Ford, and he's a great humorist, that a fishmonger did it. This is the theory of explanations, that we encounter such immensities, such absurd fields of experience, such as countless millions of periwinkles, and we explain it by saying a fishmonger did it. Ford goes on to say that it must have been a very charitable fishmonger indeed, because the periwinkles were fresh and quite expensive food, and therefore the explanation for the presence of the periwinkles was more absurd than saying a Martian brought them there or they came from a spaceship. So this is the 14 theories of explanations, that often our explanations have nothing to do with any kind of truth, but are mechanisms by means of which we comfort ourselves. Yeah. We allow ourselves to get some sleep at night. So the explanation, in particularly the scientific explanation, he saw as more a wonder management vehicle or technique in order to allow us to give some order to creation. The hairline cracks, the contradictions, we brushed aside. And this is the classic Fordian position, that our explanations are facades, if you like. The conclusion is that our imagination, our consciousness is structured by these facades which we erect, called explanations. And this, at the time, this kind of thinking at the time, in the pre-1914 world in America, was of course quite revolutionary. No one was thinking like this at all. He was the most original philosopher. Moreover, he wasn't an academic philosopher. Who reads academic philosophers? Their books are almost unreadable. But you can read Ford as you can read Rabelais. It's a great comic, if you like, philosophy, and as such, it's user-friendly. You can read it, and you can get these very, very deepened ideas about consciousness as being a system of stage constructs that we live with. We half know that we're living with falsehoods, but we call them different kinds of reality. As I say, this is the postmodern position in outline, yeah, and it's nothing to do with incomprehensible Frenchmen. It's unreadable books, which postmodernism has developed a rather bad reputation in the modern world. But this for stating basically the postmodern position, that our experience is mainly consists of advertising constructs of various kinds of strength, and his idea that we scale down experience. In other words, the simple universe of fact versus fiction is replaced by a much more sophisticated structure. I think I'll have a little break there.
That's great.
All right. All right.
Yeah, my camera's rolling.
Yes. Okay.
Could we jump to Colin Bennett's way of thinking?
Yeah. Well, I discovered Charles Fort at the university over 30 years ago, and when you're at university, of course, you're always looking for philosophers of different kinds, because you're in a thinking community, and the philosophers are bought and sold every 5 minutes. And I wasn't happy with Bertrand Russell or Whitehead. I wasn't happy with any kind of philosopher. I wanted a philosopher, if you like, to fit with the ideas of the late 60s that I was absorbing. You know, everything you can think of, from Timothy Leary to Wilhelm Reich, you know, from Allen Ginsberg to Jerry Rubin. Yeah, and there was no philosopher that fitted this world. You could say that there were one or two approximated to it, but the one I found was Charles Fort. Long dead, of course. He died in the early 1930s. But the kind of things that the 60s writers were talking and writing about didn't have a great synthesizing mind to bring them together. Individually, they were absolutely wonderful, but there was no great... Marshall McLuhan, I suppose, was the one, and that one looked to, because everybody started talking about media. Now, we're talking about 30 years ago now. Media was a fascinating thing. It was beginning to flex its muscles. It flexed its muscles in Vietnam, for the first time. Before Vietnam, colour television was a thing that flickered in the corner of the room. It was McLuhan who introduced us. Don't bother about that. Don't bother about mathematics. Don't bother about physics. Watch that flickering screen. That's the key leader. And people were turning from formal historical approaches to experience in the classical way when I was at university. I was at Oxford, to this screen, which of course a lot of people, the stiff kind of personality, didn't like at all. They thought that it was a plaything, what is this? It was a ball, it was a toy. And McLuhan introduced us all, through his books, to the theory that this was going to control our entire reality. That this output of images was going to be the number one governor of the coming universe, which of course 30 years later, looking back, it did indeed. Yeah, because almost everything is, if you like, to use a negative phrase, contaminated by media, presentation and image, and science even more so. The recent the recent I'll start again. The recent Mars Explorer episode was entertainment. So was the moonshot 30 years ago. The moonshot 30 years ago, its scientific yield, its technological yield, was comparatively zero to being a show. And so the same with the recent adventures of the Mars rover. first-class entertainment. Its scientific yield, there was some scientific yield at least, is zero. In other words, its analog rationalizations are zero before the power of its presentation. Yeah. So you're having images take over rational analog information as it was. Now, this in the 30 years back, this was a new thing to us. I saw it, so did several other people. That this was going, but the formal, stiff type said no, it's a toy, it's a bauble, it's not going to be functional, it's not going to take over society. It is pop, it's trash. That's what they identified popular culture with trash for the peasants. Yeah, and that's what often they said. Yeah, and it was going to be posh, stiff, but clever guys who were still going to be the rulers of the universe. And I'm afraid 30 years later, they're down there as engines of reality, if you like. It's Michael Jackson, excuse me. Well, this 30 years ago, this was a universe described, prophesied by people like Marshall McLuhan. But Marshall McLuhan wasn't, although a genius and a great 20th century thinker, wasn't as big a philosopher as one would have liked. And so I personally, and with quite a few other people, we were reading literature, of course, and so books were our life, night and day, and we discovered Charles Fort in some tatty old volumes. He wasn't a popular writer in his day. He was published with more than, so he was lucky, but more than Kafka, who poor Kafka, another writer whose work didn't see the light of day at all. And we found these scuffed books of Charles Fort. It was a collected volume, and we immediately read this, and we realised that we had a almost totally unrecognised writer who, though long dead, had synthesised a lot of the much later developments. Writers with brains can do this. They live in several different universes at once. Time matters very little to them. Shakespeare is still 100% relative to the 20th century. And Fort was somehow the philosopher that, the thinker, if you like, who synthesized a lot of the late 60s experience to us and brought the 20th century, the late 20th century, into focus with the depth that we required. He was also, of course, deliciously anarchist. He was deliciously anti-authoritarian. But that's why he wasn't a popular figure, particularly among scientists. Now, if you're what we admired was the heroic stance of Charles Fort. If you decide to take on the entire world, and you're chopping up chairs for firewood at the same time as trying to feed your wife and your parrot, which is only possession, then this was a 20th century hero. This was straight out of Dostoevsky, moreover. He wasn't an establishment figure at all. And so we delighted in this, that such thoughts and such books should come out of such an impoverished figure who was straight out of Dostoevsky. And as such, against American glamour, against American capitalism, against American sheen and gloss, the whole thing which is being sold through the film industry at this time. Yeah. And he stood out. And of course, to take on science itself, when scientists usually are extremely clever people, and they were building at this time, of course, a monstrous facade as we are the governors of reality. We will produce your dreams for you. We will discover the secrets of the universe for you, and it's done through objective experimentation. It's okay so long as you don't hear the animals screaming. And it's okay so long as you don't think of what we're ignoring. And we have the same problem today with regard to the UFO, the flying saucer. We have the same debate. It was initiated by Charles Fort, who was the first person before 1914 to observe UFOs and to look at the explanations to them which were absurd. And the same explanations are being trotted out by skeptics today. So he initiated this debate between the anomaly and the contradiction in experience and reality and so-called scientific fact, which tends to dismiss all these odd things. Now, if you dismiss the odd and peculiar incidents that occur in experience, you miss out, and this is another thing that Charles Fort pointed out, you miss out on the rainforest, what I call it the rainforest. Yeah. Scientists, for example, and skeptics pounce on eccentrics. They pounce on the odd. They pounce on the people who are losers. And Charles Fort, sales-wise, was a loser. And they pick on these people, and they tend to sweep them aside, and rather like bulldozers going through a rainforest. They don't see the holistic side of anomalies. They don't see the holistic side of the imagination and literature, because science is not an education, and it never will be. They don't have the reading background, and they push bulldozers into the rainforest without that reading background, without a knowledge of the humanities. The scientists are bloody hopeless. They see it as a concrete mechanistic affair, and the whole of the alternative movement in the Western world has been trying to remind them in different ways, different scale, that the objective mechanism, concrete assumptions of the separation of mind and nature are absurd, but most of them don't listen. There are a few scientists who do listen, such as Dr. Jack Safati, with whom I'm writing at the moment. He's a leading quantum physicist and very anomaly sympathetic, but he's a rarity. That's right. I'm all right now? Yes, okay. Ready when you are. Yeah.
I'm rolling again, so in your own time, guys. Oh, actually, there's just one thing I want to do very slow. Okay, I'm rolling. In your own time.
And this situation I'm describing in the thinking intellectual world and all its manifestations, a lot of these currents of thought can be traced to the non-conformities in the movements of the early 20th century. Charles Fort had a lot of affinity with the Surrealist Manifesto, with André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto. Of course, Charles Fort was an American and didn't meet Breton or members of the French movement at all. But his thinking was rather like the French Surrealistic movement, but he was applied intellectually rather than on canvas. But he had the same spirit of breaking up mechanistic assumptions which were weighing everyone down. The tragedy was 1914, mechanistic assumptions, again, the tragedy of 1914, and the slaughter that was to come. It was ominous of that. That if we go on thinking in the manner of reality is merely mechanical accretion of colonies or money and so on and so forth, he was a hippie in this sense, sympathetic, of course, to human beings, not puritanical or dialectical like the communists, but reminding us to think about a relation to mechanistic accretion. It's going to be aggression. And of course it was, and with 30 million dead. And these surrealists and people like Charles Fort were advocating a much more, if you like, hippie-like, although the word wasn't used then, holistic, spiritual view of things, without, being silly or gnomic in any sense. It was a very strong expression, and it was a warning against the slaughter. And we had similar warnings before. We had them, the movement which stemmed from alternative thinking finally took an army off the battlefield in Vietnam. It took an army off the battlefield for the first time in the history of the, war, of the world, because the Vietnam conflict was the end of this kind of conflict, in which you had mechanistic accretion again as being the final philosophy, and media helped to do that, and different attitudes to human beings, and the manifold characters and personalities, as distinct from merely flamethrower destruction. They're still around, and they can still be traced to this early reaction against the Industrial Revolution, the total success of the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay. The Harvey Oswald as Fighting Man.
Oh yeah. Yep. Oh, yeah. Mm. Yeah.
You okay? I'm rolling.
You can use Charles Fort's ideas operationally in the modern world. He's not merely an historical phenomenon, and he's not merely fodder for trendy, aging, hippie bohemians. No names, no patriots. He is an operational political philosopher. His ideas can be applied. When I was writing Politics of the Imagination, I wanted to give a chapter to how his ideas can be applied to modern conditions. And like everyone else, I've always been absolutely fascinated by the Kennedy assassination, the first Kennedy assassination. And I've always been interested, as a novelist indeed, in the character of Lee Harvey Oswald, a man who, like George Adamski, could practically put his foot through 20th century walls. 24 hours with Lee Harvey Oswald could lead to more contradictions, paradoxes and anomalies than could be conceived. It's amazing what Lee Harvey Oswald, according to the very thick books I've read about him, got out of bed in the morning and had the most surreal day between breakfast, dinner and supper. And I got the idea that through these books, by very clever scholars such as Anthony Summers, radical rationalist approaches couldn't put the 24-hour frame, any 24-hour frame of Lee Harvey Oswald into perspective. And he only had to visit the grocer, and the most extraordinary, according to these very sober people, the most extraordinary things happened. Someone saw him somewhere else, or he disappeared for 2 days. I imagine a trip, to the local hostelry for a drink would be most extraordinarily difficult for Lee Harvey Oswald. I always had this impression on him, therefore, as in the books I've read, that it's become a most extraordinary person who, like George Adamski, just walked through 20th century wars in this most peculiar way. Again, there we are, there's the package, but who to get to interpret it? I've read Anthony Summers, all the very clever people, in very thick books. Now, I said to myself, well, I want a modern application of Fortean theory. And of course, it was a revelation. I brought Fort and Oswald, as it were, together. And I found that Oswald's life was rather like the lives described by Charles Fort in his book Wild Talents. There are most extraordinary people around. This was a revelation to me at the time, that can do extraordinary things. And Fort's theory applied to it, that the conclusion is that for lots and lots of people, the structure of the day is not stable. And science only deals with the man on the Clapham omnibus. That, simplifies a situation to make the equations work and equate that situation with reality. It's rather like Pythagoras, the right-angled triangle of Pythagoras, being true for abstract lines, but the right-angled triangle Pythagoras is not correct if you assume that the right-angled triangle is made of fried sausages. The fried sausage is too complicated for Pythagoras. It's too complicated for the mathematics. And a 52 bus full of drunks in which somebody's fainting, somebody's being murdered in a snowstorm, it's a highly individualized event. Mathematics deals with it as a point moving down an inclined plane. This is totally unsatisfactory. The essence of the situation is we need this philosophy which preserves the essence and character and drama and significance of the rare event. Otherwise, this is a rainforest. The rainforest consists of the 52 buses, the fried sausages, which are defeated by mathematics. And this is Charles Fort. He gave this great vision of the function of the anomaly in terms of consciousness, society, and politics. And you can, when you get, if you don't have Charles Fort, for example, you have question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. Aeroplanes fall out of the sky. It's an accident. The cancer clusters, of course, the scientists will always call random. This is a defense, of course, and they're explaining them away, and nothing. Charles Fort goes for randomness like a fox after a rabbit. It's all connected. It's all conspiratorial. It's, in a symbolic sense, image, symbol, metaphor are built around these situations. And you have to interpret them holistically. In other words, you replace fact versus fiction by personality and society. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Ufology and...
Yes.
Okay, the camera's rolling. In your own time.
Well, my new book is called An American Demonology, and this is a book about UFOs. My interest in UFOs was sponsored by an incident. I had a flying saucer experience. And once you have a lot of people who write books about UFOs or flying saucers, some of the books are very good, but they haven't seen one. It had been a very curious day. This was about 20 years ago. The phone didn't ring, and no one called. And this is very strange. I had a play of mine being performed at the Shepherd's Bush Theatre at the time. And I dropped in 2 or 3 times a week to see the people, to see the play. And I was this day I was a bit out on a limb, which is strange for me. And I thought, well, I'll go to the theatre to see my play and meet the people, very great friends at the time. I got myself to Shepherd's Bush, and the theatre was closed. I thought, you fool, it's Sunday. I've never made a mistake like that in my life. Still feeling out of the limb, I got back to Notting Hill, and I felt rather strange. And I did something that I'd not done before. I went into a cinema by myself to see a soft porn film. And I thought to myself, sitting there, am I getting to the age where I drop into cinemas by myself to see a soft porn film? And I thought, well, maybe. And after I'd seen this film, which was terrible, called Salon Kitty, about Nazis, can you believe this? What a bloody waste of time. I saw it. I got out of the cinema and I went across the road and I bought some cat food. And I got back to the flat, which is only 7 or 8 minutes walk, and I got to this railing, which you can see through this window, and there was a blinding light in the sky. It was like a disco light. It went straight to the back of your head, and if the light had been physically that intense, I would have clutched at my eyes in pain. There was no pain. just this blinding hypnotic white light. I called on a girlfriend who lived in the basement, Karen. I saw her light on. I shouted for her to come and see this amazing thing. I then became aware of a huge black triangular shape over the square. It looked partly like an old-fashioned aeroplane, partly like the stealth bomber. Not the F-117, the B-2 Spirit bomber. And there was the light, and there was the shape. And there was Karen coming to the top of the steps. And I thought to myself, if he doesn't see what I'm seeing, I'm in trouble. She came to the top of the steps, and the light shone on her face, and her mouth opened. She had never seen anything like this in my life. That was a sense of relief. I stood there watching this, and the light faded, and the shape went away. There was then another light chasing across the sky. Out of this light came about 6 cycles of a sine wave, and the whole phenomenon vanished. Astonished, she was my girlfriend. I lived in the flat above, and I went down to her flat. We didn't say anything. As soon as I entered her flat, there was a man in black. The man in black was explainable. He'd come to see someone in the house. They weren't in. Feeling very uncomfortable, I went back to my flat. And I thought to myself, this is very strange. She, Karen, was a very dour mathematics lecturer, a good witness. And she was very upset by this. That's why I left her alone. And that's the story. The thing is that the man in black said that he'd come to see Alan. And when we asked Alan about his friend, he knew no one like that. And that's the story. It was that was the beginning of my interest. Fairly, it was a significant experience, and I thought, well, I started reading the books, and I found that a lot of people, countless thousands, had had the same kind of experience. Perhaps there's no mystery. Perhaps we're being visited by aliens from another planet or from another dimension. I don't know, but there are very strange things happening in the skies of Earth. I run a website, the Combat Diaries, and I run two expert sites. They're not done by expert sites on it. I put 2 writers on it who write about the UFO phenomena in detail, and of course they're proper investigators, and they're recording hundreds of sightings from all over the world per week, complete with photographic evidence. I don't know the truth about this, but something most peculiar is happening, and I think we're possibly being visited. I think the odds are that we're possibly being visited. As someone on Solomon's Island about the turn of the century saw a sail for the first time and wondered what he was seeing. I think that I saw a sail for the first time and wondered what I was seeing. We talk about it, yeah, what we saw. We had the most strangest experience, and as I say, she's a very dour, unimaginative person. In fact, this is a personal note that her dour nature and her lack of humour was, of course, a crisis in the relationship. It was a damn good person to have there as a witness. Someone who's rather dull, actually, and bless her, and to have registered it, yeah. But as she came to the top of the steps, I thought, I'm in trouble. I'm hallucinating. If you can hallucinate, if she said, I can't see anything, yeah. And well, the man in black, who was he? Because he said he came to see Alan, and we described him. Alan was an alcoholic, and this guy was an alcoholic, and he was a member of the Alcoholics Anonymous. He told us this, and he'd come to see Alan because he met him at the meetings. And Alan said, I've never seen anyone like that. I don't know, and he was a bright guy. He was a cinema manager. He was sharp, and He said, no one like that at the meetings at all. Because this guy was beautifully dressed. He had a nice, beautiful suit and tie. And he looked magnificent, in his middle age. And big, rather big frame, very well spoken. I said, I don't know, man, I've never seen anyone like that. But how and why Colin let him in the first place? I'm talking off camera now, if you like.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. In the light of this experience, I began reading and investigating. I found, of course, that there had long been investigations into this strange kind of ufological phenomena, and it was a fully developed modern myth, a fully developed body of mystical, if you like, experience. Mystical experience on one end, at one end, and concrete experience, if you like, from pilots and policemen at the other. And I came across official Royal Air Force and United States Air Force investigations into this phenomenon. And a book was written by Captain Edward Rupert, who was the head of Project Blue Book in the early 1950s. And he was in charge of flying saucer investigation for the United States Air Force, an official job with a staff and finances and resources. He was present on the amazing night in 1953 when Washington the Washington skies were invaded by lights that were maneuvering intelligently. The Air Force, I'm sorry to say, failed again, as it failed in 9/11, to intercept anything or to be on call. I've gone into the failure of the American Air Force in my book, An American Demonology, and paralleled it briefly with the utter failure of the American Air Force in 9/11. They don't seem to have the British fighter command to patrol up 24 hours consciousness. They think they're safe from any kind of assault. It's a Second World War hangover. And despite American technology and American management, the Air Force on the two occasions, 53 and 9/11, failed to intercept in any meaningful way. They came hours later with jet fighters, can you imagine that? The radar registered, there was a 3 radar registration of intelligently moving objects over Washington, plus countless civilian pilots' reports and reports from citizens. Now, it was Rupert's job to coordinate these different levels of perception. And he concluded, after nearly 2 years investigating, he didn't say as much, but he got as near as a serving American Air Force officer can get without being arrested, to saying that this was an invasion of intelligently controlled vehicles from an unknown origin, which passed through every single defence that America had at the time. And he wrote a book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. It was published after he left the Air Force. He was a reserve officer. Now we're talking about someone, Captain Edward Rupert, who had a very steady nerve and who was a very, very rational person. He was technologically trained, he had a degree in aeronautics, and you respect someone who's been in the Perspex nose of a B-29 off Tinayan Island in 1945, parked on the runway 3 feet away from Enola Gay, and he saw the Fat Man and Thin Man nuclear bombs being loaded there. He was a navigator, and he flew with them, and he on endless bombing missions against Japan. Now, when you take a man who's had that level of, if you like, mythological psychic experience, and he didn't actually go on the bombing missions, but his close comrades and friends with the people who did. And he says something. You listen to it. You listen to it, yeah. Because he's seen something almost inconceivable. It's rather like speaking to people like bomber pilots, such as Leonard Cheshire, who saw the devastation in European cities. You listen to them, people who've gone through that kind of experience and seen this devastation. And so they've seen something, you know, as I say, out of Dante's Inferno. So when they say something, you pay attention. And when Captain Ruffelt says, you know, we're being invaded from outer space, you accept it for all its implications, yeah. And this is in the early 1950s. The story of Captain Ruppelt is in my book, American Demonology. The book is of value from another point of view. He was a serving officer, and as such, his book is a rare sight into his book is a rare insight into what Eisenhower at the time called the military-industrial complex. A famous phrase from president, not general. He was generalized now, then he became president. He used this phrase, the military-industrial complex. Now, the military-industrial complex is Kafka's castle. It's very difficult to penetrate. In its sense, it's a fully fledged version of Kafka's castle, the novel name. It's authority. It's removed from society, and it's a book by a serving officer who is inside, at the centre of the military-industrial complex in terms of the Air Force. As a unique event. It has no parallel. And you see how the military-industrial complex works as metaphor as well as technology. You also see, because this is the 1950s, how open a society America was at the time compared to what it is now. You could still take your newborn to a nice-looking silver fighter on a grass runway and have your photograph taken by it. Yeah, try it now and you'll all be dead. The prototypes were wonderful, sexy, glamorous things. They came out from factories, silver, like silver magical emblems. The nation took pride in them. The nation was American nation. The American nation was proud of them. They were an integrated part of American society. The prototype stood there, and Disneyland made money, Boy Scout associations made money, cigarette card manufacturers made money out of these beautiful silver, magical, sexy, ethereal things. There were warplanes, yeah, but they were still glamorous things. The prototype has now disappeared. It's now nasty, an offensive thing. It's buried in pits at midnight in Area 51. In other words, the change from apple pie innocence and these beautiful silver things, they've now become nasty, devious, conspiratorial, black bats, impossibly expensive creatures buried in toxic pits at midnight because you can't break up the stealth material in any other way. And so this is wonderful. So in my book, I've focused this in terms of Ruppelt's experience and seen this long kaleidoscopic pull from the early 50s to the present day. And that's what an American demonology is about, so you better buy one, it's all very exciting. All right.